Great. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March 8th, 2022 joint meeting of the Board of Selectmen and the School Committee. This meeting is called to order. As always, it is being video recorded, and we will take a moment of appreciation for our troops serving around the globe in defense of our country. Thank you. Jess, do you want to call your meeting to order as well?
I surely do. All right. I will now call to order this March 8th, 2022 session of the Medfield School Committee, beginning with a roll call. Megan Glenn.
Megan Glenn here.
And
Tim Knight here.
you and Jessica Riley here. Anna Mae has a work obligation, but will join us around 8 o'clock. She was be here at the last minute.
Great. All right, just for planning purposes, we're going to discuss here for a bit, and then we'll open it to public question, comment, and all of that, and the meeting will end no later than 9 o'clock, or at least I will be leaving no later than 9 o'clock. You're welcome to stay.
We will remove at least 2 chairs
Yes.
at 9 o'clock.
So I don't intend to go past 9 o'clock.
So should we push the important stuff till after 9?
You can do whatever you want. I'm happy to leave now. So you have a quorum without me, so feel free. Anyway, since you've been so kind as to come to our lair for this meeting, I thought
I feel so much better about it now.
I thought I'd offer the school committee folks the first word as we begin, because this is the first time we've had a chance to talk together as at least as full boards or partial boards, 60% and full boards. We average out like 80% of board.
So obviously, we have been talking about having a meeting like this, and I've met with all 3 of you and spoken to you, and you've also spoken to all of us about this school building project and how we might go forward with that. I thought it would be very useful, after all of our conversations, to truly be able to gather in the same room, look at each other in the eyes, and really have an in-depth conversation outside of the kind of usual structure of so that we could really have a back and forth conversation around what our goals are, where we've been thinking. I think it's good that we've had a little bit of time to think over the last few months about what the town's priorities might be, the school's priorities might be, and if we can come to an agreement about how we just start to work out some of the logistical issues, because obviously we have town meeting, school building committee, bylaw studies, and we have decisions to make around whether we apply to the MSBA. We also have decisions and things that we need to kind of work out around how we, how once we do get into this process and we get funding, should we get funding at town meeting or wherever it may come from at this point, and what the timeline is like, how do we actually make sure that the town receives the information that they need and is able to give feedback in a way that everyone finds meaningful. And then, if that feedback is not taken entirely as a plan that should be put into place, right? There are going to be people who have different feelings about whether something should be at Wheelock, whether something should be at Dale, whether something should be a renovation. How do we work together so that that does not become us literally sitting in the same gym doing the same thing 3 years, 4 years from now, and we've lost another generation of kids going through the public school systems and a continuing rock building that needs some maintenance and could probably be put to good use. Either, I have no idea, or I'm not an architect, as a school or as a community center. So I think that we need to look a little bit at long timelines. I don't want to chew too much tonight, but I think it's good to have kind of a back and forth theoretical conversation. I would like to come out of here tonight really thinking very seriously about whether we all agree that, as we feel is financially responsible, that submitting an SOI to the MSBA, which does not mean we don't have to take the money, although I find that kind of fiscally irresponsible not to consider it. But I would like to think about whether that's something we could do. And then really just kind of marching forward, making sure that everyone knows what the timeline is and how we get feedback around that in a way that we can that we can feel is heard by everyone, and that disagreements are not not met necessarily on the Facebook pages, but are actually met in meetings, in feedback, and that how we mediate those disagreements. Because I just don't think our town should go through that again, truly. So that being said, on my part, I'm very much here to just listen and understand and then converse and brainstorm. Tim, do you have thoughts, or Megan, would you like to go there? I know that Tim, you've had some really very detailed kind of thoughts around.
I have a couple. I mean, I think we're just kicking it off, but I think what's top of mind to me, I have a funny feeling it's top of mind for all of us. Thinking high level tonight, is there a straw man process we have in mind? Between here and a town meeting and ideally receiving funding for an improved school, whatever that is. I think about things like what are the roles and responsibilities of the various groups. I think this, Jesse, I'm part of the school committee, but we want it. We would like a school sooner rather than later. I've thought about some lessons learned. Hey, what are some of these factors that are outside our jurisdiction that might contribute to a no vote in the town? And, I think we need to be aware. An example, I'm not saying it was, but like as the rec building came up, that's something that, hey, that might be outside our control, but that was a factor that hurt us. So I think just as we go into this process, we should have awareness of what are things like that, what are the gotchas that are out there. As it evolves, we can think about rules of engagement. Again, what happens if the school committee wants certain things? My assumption is, we're going to have an SBC, and that's really where the things really start happening. So when I start thinking about straw man process, what is an SBC? How does it get formulated? What are their roles and responsibilities? And ideally, we have something in mind as to how do we, kind of get a design that the town feels like it's been an inclusive process. Like we're thorough, and the town can ideally rally around. So again, I'm guessing these are thoughts that most of us have. How can we all kind of come together and work together on it? And I'm open to ideas, as if you folks have talked about some of those things.
I know that we have been going through a bit of a timeline on that. I've heard bits and pieces as we go through. I think it would be really helpful to be able to elucidate exactly what we know and what we don't know at this point, what might be kind of out there on the horizon in terms of true timelines about different routes. Megan, do you have thoughts before?
And I've spoken to each of you either on email or on the phone. And much of what Tim just said, I'm in complete agreement with. But I wanted to add that any future SBC that is put together, I want to make sure has greater input of what it is that the town is looking for and can tolerate in terms of a new building. And really, what I want to get out of this is how a new building or a renovated building or whatever the case may be is how it fits into the future of this town, both financially and just from a physical standpoint. If it's a new building and we can reuse the old building, unfortunately here we are, we're going through this process all over again, but much of the educational input into the building of the school is going to be the same. What I want to make sure we get right this time is just getting the pulse of the town. And that's where I came in with the survey. So hopefully we can talk about that this evening, because I just think it's unfair to, willing or not, to put together another group of people without a really solid blueprint of what it is that they're tasked with doing. So that has a better chance of getting the job done, wherever that may be, just so we can get a new school finally.
And And I know it's actually one of those things that Pete, you and I had talked about mediation, but we had also all talked about, like if we were to get to kind of a stuck point, but also then we need some data, some underlying data around independently derived, so that the entire town can trust what it is, both all 6 sides, however many kind of, well, like whatever polyhexagon this happens to be. We need a source of data that feels as though everybody in town feels as though that's the font of kind of neutrality. And I think that the warrant committee did an amazing job with trying to do that, but maybe it was just at that point, the car had been let off the rails at that point. So I think more than anything, across the board, speaking back to Marston and with Leo and with obviously our parents of kids who are coming through, and is that we just want a school that is financially responsible to the town for the long term, is not penny wise, pound foolish, and will not need to be majorly renovated at a time when we have a number of other schools that will need to be renovated as well. So if we do a tiny little renovation to kind of get things through, it will be expensive, and it will be with really poor timing for other town needs we may have. But more than anything, 100%, we just want a school the children can learn in comfortably. It is not 100 degrees on the second floor in June, and has the space and quality of infrastructure that schools require at this point, or that any basic office building requires at this point. It's not necessarily a Taj Mahal or a Cadillac. It's a really, really serviceable, well-built Hyundai. So, to use your metaphor. So, with those kind of positions open, and our own positions are just thoughts, do you have some thoughts of your own that you'd like to go into? Mr. Chair, may I offer the floor to the rest of your floor?
Pete?
So do you guys have any specific thoughts as to how you want the town to proceed? I mean, so let me start by saying, first of all, I think of building a school as really a school committee issue more than a select board issue. I mean, I feel like I'm here to help you get to where you want to go, and I want to do that. But if you guys had specific thoughts about how to figure out what it is the town wants before we try to execute on it, or
So can I just, I wanted this to come across correctly. I think the only way we build a school, it is a town issue. The school committee can say we want a school. We represent 5 voters, right? We need 67%. So, I mean, I think we do have to look at it going in. It is a town opportunity. We know we need to do it, but I think that's kind of in line with what I think Megan referenced tonight. There are going to be the gotchas where the school committee in and of themselves cannot get over that hurdle, right? And my hope is tonight's just, kicking it off, but yeah, we all agree, hey, this is a town opportunity. How are we going to work through that? I mean, that is, I think, some of these things I'm going to learn more tonight, but I do think it is a town opportunity. School committee absolutely is driving it, but we are seeking help in terms of how it can be collaborative and bringing the town together.
I do see it as more of a 50-50 prospect. And, more of a 50-50 prospect. I think about an agency that I worked for in the early 2000s where one agency had 51% of the decision-making power, and the other agency had 49%. And frankly, the 51% always held, right? So we can't necessarily continue to work within this divide of school versus town. Obviously, we are representative of the people in terms of education, but Medfield is simply too small, and the tax base is too small to be able to say, we want a school, and we want to build it, and this is how we want to do it, without truly full selectmen, warrant committee, buy-in, not only with just your word and your vote, but also within an overall communication and an overall kind of sense of purpose on both bodies, along with the SBC. Because quite frankly, I'm not an architect. I am not an educational architect. I am not even somebody who does 4th and 5th grade curriculum. That is not my wheelhouse. And I don't think it's any of yours either. Although
Hey, I
we
used
have
to-
all learned a lot.
I used to teach 5th grade.
Oh, gosh. Pete,
Architecture?
I had no idea.
No.
So I think that there needs to be maybe a little bit more of a concept here, not so much about like town and town, school, but really all together we share resources, we share people. Most people will at some point touch the schools and then perhaps continue to live in Medfield and live here before they ever had children. It needs to be a part of the full experience of our town. And I think that people have always said that, right? This is a very much informal kind of understanding of who we are. It's that we have great pride in our schools. We have great pride in being a community that comes together. I think that we need to push this together equally.
Well, the reality is that it's,
you have yours.
yeah, I mean, it's the vast majority of our operating budget, depending on you count it as 70% of our operating budget. It's the vast majority of the
Right.
square footage for which the town is responsible. It's the vast majority of our long-term capital planning. So to your perspective, I get your point of view, but it's obviously
Oh, yeah,
just from
I'm not
the
saying-
standpoint of financial stewardship, I mean, obviously it's the biggest piece of what we have to deal with. And certainly looking ahead.
So why would you
It's
want
also
to do all of that?
also essentially most of our oldest buildings as well,
Yeah.
with the exception of the fest. So
Yeah.
in terms
And that's also an
State
over
hospital.
time town process that has happened.
of
Right.
municipal buildings.
I mean, it's probably one of the first town buildings that was ever built was a school, right? So it just ends up that it's going to be older. But that's also not something that we can say, well, you guys just got to deal with that because, your buildings are old. We don't say that. And I understand that there's statutory language around the school committee must provide school buildings. But in essence, in terms of practicality, like you said, we have the most town employees serve on a daily basis than most town citizens. But they are also your citizens. They may not, like every single kid who comes to the schools, their parents, they're your citizens too. So we really do need to come together and have this kind of understanding of how we work together as a block and not so much as a, well, what do you guys say? More like having workshops than talk fests. And I think that, all of you know that these things work best if we're all talking together and feel like we have an equal part. So, I'm not playing hot potato with the school whatsoever. I'm just talking about the practical realities about how we can get things done here, now. So,
Well, and to that point, I don't know if you need another example of how this is both town and school, but I spoke to you about this. Some of what you do as a select board would completely impact what we do as a school committee. Take the state hospital, for example.
Please.
No, thank you.
and take my share.
That will have direct implications on our school population. If you go one way and, it attracts families, if we go another way and it's attracting seniors, this is a good start that we need to be meeting together and having these discussions, because I don't think we can work as islands, especially when we're looking at spending this much money in building a school, depending on, the sizes, or do we want the flexibility? Can we not afford the flexibility, or what's on the horizon? These are all just really important parts of the equation that we all need to.
And I wasn't trying to say that it's all your bailiwick. The last time around, I went to a lot of the school building committee meetings because I knew that a decision was headed my way about what the select board, how we were going to weigh in on it. So I tried to get as educated as I could about how the process was unfolding. But I guess I don't I think of the school committee as owning it more, and the select board as being more supportive of you people than are leading the way on it.
In the end, it ends up being the school building committee, because that is kind of a neutral group between the two that represent all of the interests of the town. So it ends up being a matter of the construction of the group, but also then how the peripheries are able to communicate with each other and make sure that over time, upon benchmarks, we are still aligned in our goal about how to get there and how we work out those differences if we don't feel like it's going quite the right way, or that we're feeling like there's a tension or a knot there.
So in terms of figuring out what it is that the town really wants, one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is having been told by market research people that if you do a scientific survey of 400 people, you get a very accurate reading of what people want. And so I've often wondered if we couldn't just figure out what the residents in Medfield want by commissioning a market survey.
I actually have thought about that as well. I think that's one of the very first things that I felt coming out of the town vote, both of them, last fall, is that it was very difficult to know what the pulse of the town was, because there is no paper of record any longer. There is no vetted journalism.
And I don't think there's
So it's really
any...
hard to know how people really truly feel, not only just about schools, but also about things like if the town were to need an override, I'm not saying a school budget override, but an override that would happen that was for something that was quite critical. Do we know how our town feels about, those decisions? Nobody wants to pay taxes, but what are the people's ability to kind of manage shocks to the system and or future building projects, Because this is, I think one of the things that ended up happening is that it's an enormously complex, it was almost like playing Tetris with buildings. If we put this here, then we'll put that over there, and that might fit in here. And there was no way that we could actually say that this thing in the future will happen, right? Because those things had not come up for a vote yet. Was it entirely possible that Park and Rec would take the Dale Street School? Yes. Was it entirely possible that the school committee would have voted at the time in which they did not need the school any longer to decommission it? Yes. But was it 100% guaranteed? No, because we couldn't put it in front of an ATM yet. So, how do we deal with those uncertainties, and how does the town deal with those uncertainties?
And I think as we sit here today, there's no agreement on the facts of what happened.
Yeah.
And that,
I think it's a six-sided thing.
So I agree with what you're saying. So if we had a survey, it's a great place to start. Would it make sense, what's the goal of the survey, who's designing it, even outside of third party? I think that's something that would fall in as we formulate an SBC, would be a natural place, because that's the board responsible to try to move it forward. That's one idea that I look at. I'm not kicking the can down the road saying we don't, wait, but I think that seems like those that are part of the SBC were part of designing the survey, if it is a third party, hey, this is what we want to achieve. I would think people would feel at least positive about that way of kicking things off. Mm-hmm. That's my view. I am all for, something along those lines. I also do, I think the SBC becomes, that's our, our bridge or our ship to kind of, now we are moving forward. As you said, hey, it's the school committee, we want it. And we all have to think about, okay, how do we formulate that SBC? What is the next, 6 to 12 months? Once formulated, there's going to be a recommendation and, kind of a straw man, that's where I'm going to, we want to be thoughtful about that. And that's, Megan, what you just brought up is the exact same thing that, I could think of 5 or 6 things, like you mentioned, state hospital, that are, again, outside our control and jurisdiction, but we need, as that SBC is formulated, we at least are aware, hey, these are the 4 or 5 things, some of which we might need to go to the select board and say, hey, how might we handle this when this happens? And that's before we get too far down the, down that process.
Are you saying that you want the new SBC to be the ones that run the survey?
I would be the ones, yes, I would think that the newly, when that is formulated, that's when it's...
I am saying before even that new group is formed. My opinion would be to do it immediately. To give them
Still fresh?
Well, it's fresh, but also so that anyone that then volunteers to be on that committee is fully aware of what it is, the direction that is going in, and it takes out the contention, or, because that's
Yeah,
what I feel.
so no, that's great, because I also think, like, where my opening remarks, roles and responsibilities, the roles and responsibilities of the SBC are, maybe it's not, listen to the town, formulate a plan, bring a plan forward to the town, secure funding. I'm saying, but we need to figure out what those are.
It just would take some of the onus off of the, you're not listening, or you didn't hear the town, about what we said, I don't want
So
to
agreed,
feature
but then,
SBC.
so who's responsible to design the survey? That would be my concern.
Right.
Right? So if nothing else, if we all said, hey, we agree with this new SBC, that's, they're going to have, that to me is, at least there's accountability. Because I may join the SBC 2 months later and I say, well, how did that get formed? That's how I look at it going into it.
But I mean, one way or the other, right? I mean, people are going to want to have input into the body that they see as the one that's most relevant to making the recommendation, right? So
absolutely.
if the SBC is the one that's most relevant to making the recommendation, they ought to do most of that work, right? And take most of that input before. If whatever the body is that's going to make the recommendation to the SBC is going to make the recommendation on the issue people care about, then you have to design a process on that pre-body, whether it's another committee, whether it's the school committee, whether it's just a market research firm that's going to come up with a survey and hand the survey to the SBC and say, go build this building. I mean, it seems to me, I think, Tim, to your point, you've raised the right issue, which is if we talk about the process, my view on this has been that the new SBC should be the main locus for this, right? That's has the most time, will have the most time to devote to this, devote to that exclusively, and is charged with making a recommendation with all the various inputs, and that the public input, the public hearings, if there's a market survey that's going to be done, that's the right body to do it. That's been my straw view of this, that, because you don't want to, if you're not going to do it that way, then really all of the process that matters is whatever the pre-process to the SBC, you're just saying to the SBC, go build us a building, which makes it a much more technical body rather than a real deliberative body that's taking input, right? Because people are only going to have so many views on what kind of brick you should use and what the plumbing should be, right? I mean, on the main issues, on location, on general cost, on basic concept, those are the things that most people are going to care about.
Right.
And so, again, my view has been to have the most kind of robust process possible. You want to have the SBC the one to do that. That's why you would have the SBC as a cross-section of people, is because you want that body to be the one to take that input and make that recommendation based on that deliberation, right? And that's why I think the market survey, I see it as an input rather than an answer, because if you have a binary question of A or B, you can get good research, right? Coke or Pepsi, you can get research. If it's three different factors and somebody's going to say, well, I would pay more if I got my way on these other 2 points, but I would pay nothing if I don't get my way on those points. That's a different answer than...
I think that's the construction of the ideas. And I think that what we have been thinking about is not like, it's not, do you approve of brick or this, that, or that. It's what's your tolerance for, what is the town's tolerance for cost? Because that ends up, our educational plan very specifically called for a replacement of the Dale. Now, at the time, we've all kind of gone down the road around population and everything else, but indeed, the educational plan that came out of all of that planning through the SBC and through the focus groups, regardless of whether it's done in the middle of the pandemic or not, and hopefully we won't have that particular challenge this time, is that it was, a replacement for the building. We wanted to have it kind of like a school that would last 50 years at least. But if the town cannot tolerate, if our taxpayers cannot tolerate the amount of money it would cost to build a separate school that might serve over time to take in or consolidate grades if that were an issue over the years or whatever. If we can't tolerate that cost now, then we probably need to know that now. You know what I mean?
But I
Like,
think, and I think,
I think-
Jess, you have that chance to,
yeah.
I would say one comment, and then I'll,
Yeah, please.
it's just that I think, if you think of the education plan, right, you think of the educational goals, part of this process, I think, is that the school committee has to prioritize,
Yeah.
right? You're not gonna get everything that you want, right? So
No,
among the 4 or 5 major points,
I want the
education.
Hyundai with maybe
But what's the most, right, but what's the most
right?
important, right? Is the most important,
Right.
you know, is it the elimination of transitions, is it this, is it that, whatever those things are, here's our ranked choice. And then when you get to the SBC stage, who are looking at the costs, saying, look, this is their number one priority, but that's the most expensive thing, right? So if you want that thing, you can't get these other 3 things. And so trying to harmonize your education plan, your educational goals with what's realistic from a cost. That's what I'm saying in terms of the input from the school committee.
Yeah.
Saying, look, this is our priority. This is what we want.
So that's great.
Because that drives a lot of decisions about how you trade things off. If your number one educational priority is X, that might lead down one route or another. And
So that
how I
really
get
clarifies
it.
for me, thank you very much. That really clarifies for me where we're going with this kind of conversation around the school committee drives, right? Like, let's talk very specifically about what those driving factors are from us, and then how we all, as a town, also understand the cost implications. And so we can prioritize till the cows come home, and we're happy to do it. But if the important priorities are ones that the town doesn't feel like they can, and I'm talking about the tax base and our legislative body, doesn't feel as though they can support, well then, maybe we get 2 of the lower priorities and make a better situation than we have right now. So, please.
So, true to form, my whole perspective is pretty much out of line, partially out of line with what everybody has said, and I partially agree with what everybody said, so it's a little different. I think we're being way too linear and way too mechanical in how we're trying to address this building. We're talking about a building, and we want to do surveys, and we'll do trade-offs to tell us you want this or what that. And the way I'm looking at this is that in this past cycle, there were a number of different groups who cared about a number of different things. And sometimes they almost looked like they were the same thing. Like there were some people that wanted Dale because they wanted a school at Dale. And I think there were some people who wanted Dale because Dale represents something to them about this town and what Dale was. And it's got a whole lot to do with community values and not about a particular education program or what grade is there. And it's not like we're going to find, well, which of them is the major group. What we're going to find is there's a bunch of different people who cared about a bunch of different things. And the thing that I was hoping we would be able to do between November and the time a building committee is formed was to open up that more expansive discussion to say, okay, there's all these people who care about all these different things. How much of that, everybody's not going to get everything they want, that we know that, but is there a concept that we can come up with that hits what people value in, financial dimensions, education dimensions, this town value dimension, all that stuff? Is there a concept that we can come up with for the school that suddenly gives people the chance to come back together? Because we've gone through a year of being driven apart, and we all started, I think, I'm pretty sure that 99% of the people in the town, if you asked them, do we need a new school, everybody's agreed that we need that. So the only question is, what school, what's it look like? To be honest, going all the way back to the school committee versus the selectmen and stuff like that. Well, no, I want to go back to that for a minute, because I'm about to say, and it feels to me like it's the school committee that needs to create the strategic vision for what we're trying to create for, in my mind, this is opinion, so I'm not trying to tell you what the answer is. In my mind, what is our long-term vision for the elementary grade education configuration here in the town? Because if you don't have a picture of that, then it's hard. Let's for a second here say, well, there was a school going to go in at Wheelock. Well, as a building going in at Wheelock, it's something to fight about. If it turns out that there's a bigger picture of what we're trying to build toward for the elementary grades. I'm not even trying to figure the whole thing out. If there's a bigger thing, and at this point in time, it's appropriate to do this piece of it in terms of this big picture, I think that helps address some of the opposition that we had. So that's what I'm looking
I actually
for.
think you're right, but I also think that that comes down to communications and marketing, which our feasibility study did not have in a way that was professional and cohesive. It was a lot of, as many things are here in Medfield, a lot of incredibly hardworking, intelligent people trying to get the message out. But the noise and the differing opinions and the, no, but it's the water, or it's this or that, because it wasn't just about having a building to wheelock. It was, but there could be a water issue, but there could be an archaeological issue, there could be this, there could be that. And it ended up being kind of like death of a thousand cuts in a lot of ways, and I understand that. But I think that that's actually more of a communication, and to what I think we have all talked about tonight and had concerns around, a neutral and trusted third-party source of information so that people can come to one well and all dip from the same water in terms of what's factual.
So as
Because
Megan
that's
already
actually,
knows,
we
I
had
disagree with that. Not because...
No, but we did have that. But the fact of the matter is that when we go to the MSBA and we're having conversations with them and we're saying, please, we would like your $19 million. And they've said, okay, that's great, and we're going to provide 2 grades to you, and we think it's this many. Even if, like, the next day that it opened, we didn't have every classroom filled, might at some point have it. Or, probably more likely, as many people have said, and as Mike has maintained all along, perhaps our population wouldn't go there. Perhaps we would be able to consolidate. But you can't say, well, you're in the middle of the MSBA process. We could consolidate this, but I think
My
those
point
are
is, that's not
conversations.
strategic. That says, well, maybe it won't happen, and then we'll make a strategic decision to consolidate like this.
Well, I
We
think
will
that
just
that's-
kind of make a practical decision that we kind of fell into, and I'm...
I would not characterize it as falling into. I would say that, given all possibilities, there is a general idea that we would like to have our educational plan more unified, but the town itself has said that they do not want to leave the two, or the system of having all kids go through school, through elementary school together. That is data that we have from the very beginning of the time that Dr. Marston got here. Because it's not a great education, like neighborhood schools are a little smaller and they're a little better.
Jess, how
But
did
we
you
know
get that?
people want to be together.
Jess, how did you get that data?
That was one of the first things that Dr. Morrison did when he came to town, is that he surveyed parents and townspeople and...
The story I've heard on that particular thing, which is fine, I grew up with a town that had neighborhood schools, so I'm a big fan of
I've
that.
done them all.
But then I talked to Scott McDermott, and he grew up in a town that didn't, and he said, I got a good education, so
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's not a good education,
I'm not
so
holding
don't-
my elementary education from
This
50
isn't
years
an
ago.
argument,
But the
but what I'm
issue,
trying to
the
say
issue
is
that I
that-
heard about why people felt that way is there'd be one old school and one newer school, and people didn't like the idea that their kids would go to the older school. I accept that, I think it's a shame. But
I think this points to our issues around communication and being able to move beyond the "but I heard" to the actual understanding. And perhaps that is part of the market survey. Perhaps that is part of what comes out of the SBC, not only a tolerance for spending, but also what is the town's tolerance for changing grade levels? What is,
So we're still getting too mechanical. Here's my point. Right now, between now and the time the building committee is in place, and I agree, the building committee, I'm actually optimistic that with this bylaws review committee, we can expect we will see a building committee with a composition that it will be reasonable for us to say, we think you are a body, you have a responsibility for doing your best to reflect the at least consensus, or the core of the consensus of what the town wants. And we want you to do that. We want you to tell us that. I think that's what we can hope for. Before that happens, there's, I think, work we can do to bring the town together as residents in a conversation that, A, it would be an added burden on the building committee that they probably don't need because they got a big enough project on their own as it is, and B, it doesn't just waste 6 months with us sitting in neutral, going nowhere. I think the opportunity is there to do that. So they can agree with you that we don't need to dump that survey. I'm not arguing against a survey by itself, but there's a caution and a comment. If you do that survey has to be done so well that the people in town agree the results of that survey reflects what they think. You can't use the survey as, we did a survey and this is what you said, so open wide and here comes the medicine. We can't do it that way. There's a risk there.
I think that we all understand that there are friction points.
Okay,
that
so
happen. No, nobody's saying, Gus, here's open wide and shove this down your mouth. We're not doing that here.
so that's fine.
I think that you're right, there is a two-pronged process, that there should be a feedback process. Do I think that November, December, January were maybe still a little too raw and there was some scab picking? Yeah, so I think probably now is a little bit better time where people have perspective.
Yeah.
But I also think that there's an important part around the idea of having an independent organization, marketing organization, be able to do that. And perhaps that independent organization also runs some of the feedback. This is what we do with a strategic plan. We bring people in.
Here's my problem, and this is, you've heard a little bit from me on this too, Megan. We're all elected officials, every one of us. The people in this town have voted to elect us. So I understand that when you just talk to people, or when you let them, or they talk to you, you're getting a somewhat random set of inputs. But there's a part of me that says this cannot be an antiseptic process where some neutral third party does a survey and tells us something. I don't actually, if we got to a point where we needed a facilitator to simply process that whole thing, the whole conversation, the public conversation, because people come in with pitchforks and tar and feathers. Okay, but my point is there's a leadership responsibility that we collectively have to be able to give people in this town a chance to say what's on their mind, in some cases to push back and debate with them on it, or test what they say. And the point of that isn't to necessarily get to 100% reliable ground truth. The point of that is to get as many people in this town to understand that they are being listened to. No promises they're going to get everything they want. I mean, because you can't give everybody everything they want, because you can't go in all those directions. But I think one of the things we need to make up in this town is the perceived gap in having people be able to say what's on their mind and have it heard, truly heard, and considered. Not accepted, not supported, merely considered. And that's the thing. That's the thing that right now, before that building committee comes on board, I see this as the opportunity for us to do that.
One of the things that I have really struggled with is what is being heard and listened to, but not having your specific suggestion taken. How, and this goes to the mediation issue, right, that we had also talked about, like, if there is a group that does not agree, how workable, how do we work out those bumps so that we do not have that same level of friction? And I think that one of the things that we're really talking about is, the school committee and Dr. Marston and the administration, they have practice in setting an educational plan together. We can prioritize, we can do all of those things. We have our ducks in a row. It ends up being, again, this community process that we're all talking about, right? Where we have these conversations and we say, right now, elected officials, all of us said, yes, school, until we didn't. And that was just a difference, that was your thinking at the time. But as bodies, we all kind of came together, and the elected people here, and we agreed. And there was a group of people that did not feel that we were supporting their interests.
Well, I just
Okay.
thought we were wrong substantively, I mean, which
Yeah.
is,
And that's fine.
sometimes that
But-
happens.
And that happens.
Right.
But I am not sure that we can then say, because I, I love the idea of like, okay, I have an elected official, I have had my input, I either voted for them or not, but they now represent my interests. I'm not sure that that is a modern view of elected officials anymore, particularly on the local level, you know? I think that there's such a, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. I don't think it's bad at all.
You
But I
don't think what, help me out,
I'm sorry.
the view that you don't think is there anymore is what?
I don't think that there's a view there that we, once we have heard, if we do not agree with somebody's decision, then we are somehow not speaking for the body of the town, right? And that the decisions that we make and the things that we think about and the deliberations that we make are not necessarily held in as much esteem as they might have been in years past. I think that there is a significant portion of just the internet and everything else that, so I don't.
Let's look at that
I want to
differently.
push back on that a little bit though, Jess, just, I mean, I think, you're never going to get 100% of people
No,
who feel like
I don't
they,
think you are.
some people are always going to think if you don't agree with them, you didn't listen to them, right? That's just the reality.
That is true.
But that's not always the case for everything, right? And the reality is, if you look at historically, right, in any of these override votes, there's a certain percentage of people who are always going to be no matter what.
Yes,
Right? And that
we have
number
talked
is
about
somewhere between 35 and 40%, right?
Yes.
Even in 2018, high turnout, zero organized opposition, 37% no, right, on the original one, and higher than that on some of the other stuff, right? So that's just the reality. There's always going to be, but having sat through, on housing issues, for example, lots of very contentious meetings. There are certainly some people who go through all those meetings and unless they get their way, are never going to think that their concerns were heard.
That is
At the
true.
same
And
time,
I would like
for
to
some folks,
figure that
you know
out.
what, they do sit through those meetings, and through the way the process works out, they do feel like their concerns are heard. And so I think, there's two pieces to this. One is getting to a process that gets to a good substantive decision.
Yes.
Because I do believe, and maybe I'm naive about this, if you get to a good substantive decision, most of the time you can persuade people to support it, right? Not 100% of the time, not all the time, what have you. That takes into account the fact that people have different sort of opinions on substance. But that at the end of the day, people feel like they were at least listened to in the process, and listened to at the right point in time in the process, right? Because obviously, at some point, there was a town meeting vote, there was an election, people had a chance to vote, and they were heard through that process, right? Ideally, you'd like to vet as many of those things, get people to have as much substantive input as possible, because, nobody knows everything, and so you can get a better overall outcome. And I think my hesitation, Gus, that I've had with your approach to this, is my concern is if we're going to be asking, and it goes to what you're asking the school building committee to do, right? And kind of the less you're asking to do, the less important the school building committee is, right? If all the important decisions are being made before the school building is created, or the things that people care about are going to be decided before the building committee is created, and that committee is less important, right? If they're going to be making a substantive recommendation, then I think we have to give the body that's going to make the substantive recommendation as clear a slate as possible, so you're not going into it saying, here's the result of the survey, you must come up with a building that meets the survey, here's what we elected officials have discerned, or you can watch the videos of our meetings and see what people said, and you can distill from that process what you're supposed to do. That's the hesitation I have, is that if we're going to give that committee, and I think we should, try to learn from the last process, improve upon it where we can. My concern is only, and again, I'm gone in 3 weeks, it doesn't really matter, other than as one voter, is that we not set that committee up for failure by telling it in advance, here are these 5 substantive things you must do. That's the hesitation that I have.
So
I wanna be very
too much
clear.
I want to make a counter argument.
What I'm suggesting, though.
I want to make a counter to that point, though. I would look at, I agree that you don't just sit there and say, look, here's your marching orders, here's how many pounds of nails you need and how many sheets of plywood. I agree you don't do that. But if you were going to build a house and you wanted it to be a really nice house, And so you found a really good builder to build that house. You might want to hire an architect before you hire the builder. And the difference is that you want to hire a good builder that takes that architect's plan and is going to come in back to you and say, I know this is what you said you want the house to be, but, we're looking at the site, we're looking at some other things, there's some new stuff that's come out. We think you really should consider these other new ideas to make this an even better house. I think that's the kind of building committee we want. Not one that says, well, we could hire an architect, you're a builder, but before you do the building, we want you to architect the house. And they're going, well, we're not really the architects. We don't have architectural skills, but if you want to, we're good builders, so we've done some stuff. We can put something together. It's that strategic level stuff versus the carrying out of the project. And I see there's issues at that strategic level that interfered with what we tried to do last time. And I'm kind of saying, can we get them dealt with ahead of time, or at least, at the macro level, deal with them ahead of time, so that when there is a building committee with a good cross-section of people representing the town, but maybe not the most sophisticated, conflict resolution, public communications, maybe they don't all have those skills. They don't need those skills because they're not getting hit with what I would call strategic conflicts. And I'm just looking at, I feel more strongly about it because we have this period of time between now and the time we get to a building committee, and where it's like, we could be doing some of this.
So let's take a, maybe just...
1 second, round up and say, is there anything we have actually agreed to, or that we feel like we can say right now, we are in a position that we could continue discussions?
Well,
I want you to talk now, but I want to just, as we're having this conversation right now, let's make sure that we're really not just banting back and forth kind of tiny points, but really understanding what the strategy is here. So Megan, pop in.
I've highlighted a few of the notes that I really like. The SC, the school committee, what are the 4 or 5 features that are top priorities? I think that's a great idea. If I was joining an SBC, and I had that input to start, that would be fantastic. I forget who it was. Is there a concept that, I think it was you guys, that we can come up with? Is it 2, 3? Hey, that's good input as well. We can't say, we don't know necessarily what the cost implications and whatnot are, but hey, that's concept A, we like that better than B. I agree with that. I would agree it's helpful to have a third party involved in a survey. Right? I know I can have a third party involved in the survey, though. Be careful. That doesn't mean it's neutral, because what are the inputs we give them? So that's not like a silver bullet. And then I do, I think there's debate on gathering input. If the SBC was formed in June, July, I think then if I were joining the SBC, I would want to be able to gather input from the town. Do I trust the way it was done? That's kind of how I'm looking at it. Now, if we're saying we're not going to have an SBC until January, I wholeheartely agree. We better get going and gather that input. So, I think that's where, to me, kind of a straw man is, do we have any, when might we have an SBC?
It comes down to the timeline.
Yeah, but that's, I am, I'll be open, I'm more with where Michael's coming from in terms of, hey, if I were to join that, I'm not on the school committee or anything else, I would like to have, how do we gather this information? I would like to kind of set up the ground rules for that SBC at the beginning.
It's got to do with the question that you're trying to answer with the survey, I guess. Is it the strategic question, or is it the school question? Is it a building question?
I was thinking more of it as strategic and town fiscal ability. Just a bead on where our town is now. What percentage truly within Medfield will always say no, right? We kind of banty around this like 37, 40% number. It's a good number. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Is that true for our town? Where do those demographics come from? Will that continue to be true over 20 years? These are good questions for us to know as we're thinking long-term, not just about this school and a 20-year or 30-year debt, but the other things that happen. that I see you are shaking
I
your
don't-
head before. This is not the spirit of a workshop.
No, actually it is. This is absolutely a good discussion. I bristle every time I hear this 30 to 35% won't approve overrides. Because I look at this as a town, I've been here for 25 years, and I moved here because it appeared to me that Medfield was a slightly more affluent town than the town that I grew up in, which is to say it was a town that didn't have unlimited money, but had a commitment, it's had a historic commitment to educating its kids. So when we kind of dismiss that commitment, not just on the part of people who have kids, but people who are here in town who don't have kids, who still consider a very important dimension of Medfield being the job we've done in raising our kids and educating our kids, when we sort of dismiss a third of the town as, well, they won't vote for anything anyway,
I don't think anyone's dismissing this. They're just saying historically that's what the number is. And that's
well,
just what-
if you're citing 2018 as evidence, we had
I
a
mean, look
combined...
at it over the last 20 years. I mean, look at, we did 8 overrides in 10 years between 2000 and 2010. Look at the numbers for those. I mean, you can look at them. It's just, I mean, it's.
So what do you do, so let me try a different way. What do you do with that? What do you do with that
I think it's just the
number?
reality. I
So,
think it's
but
just-
what does it mean? Let's
I don't know
not...
if it means anything. I'm just saying, I think it means that.
Never meet that 2/3, right? What do we have to meet that almost unachievable 2/3 goal? And
No, it's not, the town meeting always passes by 2/3. I'm just saying, you know, again, I don't want to
For 50, 60, 70,
overread the data.
$80
It's just what the,
we'll pass that?
There's-
it's what the history
That's
has
my
been
point.
over the
There's
last 20
been very
years.
few overrides that have failed
Yeah.
till last
Until you
November.
get
So
into,
when we...
nosebleed
yeah.
territory,
Yeah.
and yet that is the cost of building. I remember, when we built the, public safety building, we were absolutely astounded by how much that cost. We voted for it, but it was not, and then this is it. How much was that again? Because that seems like an amazing bargain in today's numbers.
Well, it
it's good
depends on
time to
who you
build.
ask. You look at it actually cost,
People with
people
longer
will tell you what it
memories,
costs.
or people who were barely
Yeah,
sleeping
it
at
was less
the
than
time, like
$16
me.
million.
There is another dimension of this, and I'll throw it out there with it, but I don't want to drag it out too much, is we have an issue of state-level funding, primarily state-level funding of Chapter 70 funds. Bob, you were at Denise's report to the town, and I appreciated the question you asked. And I was first alarmed, and now I've just decided to take it as ground truth, by the answer you got. Because the question you had was, will we ever see any relief from the state from these measly 1% increases in our Chapter 70 funds? A couple of years ago, Denise brought that up and said, I try to get more money from Medfield because of you're paying all these taxes in, and basically I have colleagues who say, well, I've got towns that are worse off, and that therefore she's basically saying, I'm trying to make the argument,
It's very
and I can't
hard.
make it.
Yeah.
But this year, she told you what the state is doing was fair. That rang a real alarm bell for me. I was mad to start with, and I've gotten over it. And now I'm sitting there saying, okay, as a town, we need to understand the only reason we're getting 1% increases is because the state doesn't quite have the gall to just say, you are one of the most affluent towns from an income standpoint in the state. Therefore, you can take it out of your back pocket. And so we are going to continue to squeeze you with Chapter 75. We can have a state rep who is the vice chair of the House Ways and Means Committee who does not have the influence to change that trend, who is now in an even more influential position and does not have that influence in a state where senior leaders in the legislature do have influence to do things. I accept that as ground truth. But as we start to think about the funding and what we can afford in this town, we need to recognize that the trend on the state level is a continued slow strangulation reduction of state aid. Therefore, our challenge is to figure out how do we maintain a high-level school when over time we're going to get more and more to the point where the money is going to come out of our back pocket. I come to a, huh?
That's been a 20-25-year trend.
Yes.
Oh, well, yeah, certainly, I documented from
It's not just the
FY,
school aid, it's the
Yeah,
general
but even
aid.
more-
from FY9 to FY18.
Yeah.
FY9, 30% of the town's budget was state funded. FY18, it was 20%. So roughly a percentage, and think about it, if school budgets are going up as they did last year, like 3.99%, that's 4%, and the state is giving you 1%, and the schools are 70% of the budget, you can start doing the math to see how that aid does continue, and it's not going to stop. We're not suddenly going to be at that level.
This is actually one of the things that I've always said. There is no part of the funding of the formula that the state uses, which they don't fully fund anyway, that allows for the amount of taxes that individual taxpayers.
Well, and beyond that, the
Or
state
commercial,
does
so
not,
many other places
beyond that,
do
the
that.
state does not adjust those income calculations or how they think about it to account for the diversification of the tax base.
Right.
So when we start looking at the total load on residential taxpayers, if we could, one of these days I'll do it and figure out, okay, what's the percent? We pay 95% is coming out of the residential tax base. So the fact that the income numbers look high, well, some other town like Cambridge, the income numbers look high, but their tax burden is not the same because of their tax base. My point in all that, and I didn't quite mean to, I didn't want to go on that. I didn't want to go on that long, but my point is I think these are all strategic issues. This is at the strategic level that I've been at. I'm sitting there saying we can't afford to allow our school-age population to grow just as a function of what happens to happen with the state that has so many different programs that are designed to put in basically lower-priced housing into a town like ours. Because the legislature is saying, but these folks are so rich, they'll take it out of your back pocket, their back pocket. If we don't stop that, Medfield turns into a perhaps ethnically diverse, but absolutely not diverse town of financial elites who have a couple of demonstrator projects over here that show our compassion for those not so fortunate. This already came out 3 years ago when we had the overrides with someone who is a relatively new resident in this town who basically said, well, I moved in here for the schools 4 years ago. If there are people here in town who can't afford these kinds of tax increases, and he didn't know it, but he was talking about the people who built Medfield. His comment was, perhaps they should find a town that's better suited to their financial means. Play the process out, and you start to see it. When right now, with our taxes where they even are right now, we are no longer that financially attractive, high-quality education town. We're just another one of those towns that has a good school system that costs a lot to live in. And I don't know where we wind up, but I know that's not the Medfield I came here for, and it's not the Medfield I've seen. And so, aside from anything else here, I'm fighting to not allow us to simply drift into that kind of a town. And I went way too long, and I apologize.
Thank you, Chris. I'm not sure I agree with you substantively, but
Well, undoubtedly, that survey, we can ask people.
right. Would you? Yeah. No, I mean, I think that there's, I do
Suggest
understand
you were looking
your
for points of agreement.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
And
Yes.
so-
I did that. No, I had to.
Which is kind of what I do.
Start-
Points of agreement. I think that we understand that there's some
That's a great
level of
question.
neutrality.
First off, there is no debate about whether we want to get a new school.
Right.
Second,
Right, exactly.
in the early comments that I heard from people, I think we all acknowledged that in this new process, we need to ensure there's more open input from the public, and I think that that's absolutely true. I'm not sure if this is a point of agreement, but I kind of think it is.
Well, hold on, unless you know it's a point of agreement.
Well, I'm sorry, I'll let you judge. There was
All right.
it was the early discussion we had around school committee versus selectmen. I think when I was on the warrant committee, there were times because of the function of the warrant committee, we were in a position to tell the selectmen they couldn't do what they wanted to do because we didn't have the money, or we weren't going to approve the money. And that bothered me a lot because it was sort of like of an appointed body overriding an elected body.
Always
And I had a discussion with Richard DeSorger at the time about that. In the same way, even though the three of us are on the Board of Selectmen, I view the school committee as being, if anybody is in town, the visionaries for where the school program, the education program in school needs to go. So even as a selectman...
Right, so did I just hear you say that you feel like the school committee should be the visionary about where the school should go?
Not school location. I'm saying where the I'm saying where the schools, in other words, the concept for what we're trying to build in our school program, I'm very reluctant to take actions as a selectman that I've got to try very hard to make sure any actions I did take or any positions I took would not be driven by the fact, I don't agree with that. Because it's like, it's your job to do that, and it's our job to point, to Pete's point.
Right?
Right.
We each have roles and responsibilities, as Tim has said, but we can also, and need to, as townspeople, as elected officials, and as part of our own, kind of oath, that we do not put the town in a space in which they are, in which we are being fiscally irresponsible. And that's actually part of our mission statement. We want to be fiscally responsible. At the same time, fiscal responsibility can't always be what we see in front of us, but what we have to see out ahead.
So the fiscal part of it, I see as part of our responsibility, but the concept of where you're trying to get is yours.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a point of agreement that we'd all agree.
That's your 51%.
Yeah, I mean, Gus, even on that,
Right?
like even, because there's the concept and the priorities,
Yeah.
you're grouping them together.
Right.
I think we all absolutely agree.
Okay.
And you, what Gus has said, and then I'll survey us in terms of those points since he put them out, that there is really no debate about needing a school or improved school campus in one way or another, wherever it is. We clearly need to have a better school than we have in Dale Street. I think that's great, than what we currently have. And that this kind of school committee, and I think that we should remove the word versus from our vocabulary maybe, right? The selectmen do have a fiscal and long-term responsibility around strategy, and that's kind of your 51% of, if we're using that metaphor, so that we obviously weigh in, consider that, think that's very important, but you are the kind of fiscal managers of the town, and that we are those who put forth educational planning. You certainly should also, as parts of the town, as part of the town management, should have input into that as well. It's a back and forth, but there's always going to be one group that has a little bit more expertise.
I'd put it differently.
Please do.
The school committee, I think, are the stewards of this town's education program.
Agree.
The Board of Selectmen are the stewards of the town and its culture and what it is as a town. And most of the time, those two things, if they're not exactly in parallel because of what this town cares about, they're not, if there were two horses hooked to the wagon and there was nothing that forced them to be together, even if they were left on their own, you would only have to occasionally pull the rein one way or the direction to keep them both going in the same way.
Can I survey you guys about that concept? Or about that concept of the school committee as the steward of the educational part of the town, but you indeed are the stewards of the town. So that does that then mean that...
It's not a subordinate thing. It's,
right.
Yeah, okay.
So that it's more like gears, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But we also have impact because of our knowledge as citizens and as people who have been in the education system, who understand the inner workings of a school district, have input into those long-term strategic plans that have details that you may not intuitively know about, right? And that we will work together to communicate those with each other. And we can see that as an agreement that we will have over the long term or for the next 3 weeks.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yep.
Right, so we're reaching some level of consensus here about what each of our roles are, and that we do believe that it's important to continue to touch base as groups and make sure that we're doing our jobs and that we're weighing in on each other's priorities within this school project, as well as long-term. You can see. That make sense? And that the second point that I heard, and would anybody else like to speak to that?
I'd love to hear from Megan just for a minute or two.
Oh, boy. For your.
No, I just haven't heard from you in a little while, so no pressure on that, but no, I just,
No pressure.
I mean,
you got 3 weeks.
You have up to 49,
Let it out.
you have up to 49 minutes.
There's been a lot of pontificating going back and forth. I'm generally the one that cuts through it, and I'm just going to go right back to where I started, that there was distrust in the process. And what I'm hearing you say is, with all due respect, exactly what the SBC did. They asked for public input numerous times, and they received public input numerous times. Distrust and conspiracy and friction still happened. I'm trying desperately to avoid that whole scenario playing out again. I'm sticking by the fact that there's information out there that we don't know, that we can't collect, and that the only way that the town is going to come to a consensus is if we survey people. And I know that you really strongly believe that a public forum is the way to do that. As elected officials, people should come and talk to us. And great, that has not worked, because there are so many people that either can't or don't want to, or just forget, I don't know, they don't show up, and they're not being heard. So the voices that we hear, that are here, we've heard you, there's a contingent of people. Are they everyone? I don't know. Maybe they are. Maybe everybody feels the way that you feel. Chris and I have talked. Like, we just want to hear from everyone and meet them where they're at. If we could get a neutral party to call it market research, I don't care. I'm not saying that we're going to hand it to an SBC and say you have to do this, but just clearing the air and starting from there. That's how I feel very strongly about the need to do that. And it's from a cultural perspective too. And I feel like the constituents that elected me are asking for something like this, to be heard. And in today's, like you said, that's just the way things operate in this day and age, that as much as we want everyone to show up and get up in front of a microphone and speak, they're not going to do that.
No, it doesn't happen.
So just for proceed, you're suggesting doing that survey before the new committee is formed?
Like yesterday.
No.
I believe the day after the vote failed, that's where I was.
so like, I mean, we all agree a survey is something we want. We don't necessarily understand timing or how it gets built, right? We could at least table that for a minute or two.
But
right?
it does go
At the very least, it gives
communication.
everyone an opportunity to say something.
No, I understand. We want it. It's that, where I could use professional help is how do we actually get greater percentage of engagement? The number of people that showed up and voted. I'd love to have those number of people participate in a survey.
Yeah.
I forget who, I think Pete said 400. 400 would be a good
Could it go out to
representation.
all registered voters in the town? I don't know.
So, and
I don't know
think
the
that's, again,
the logistics.
the professional
Yeah,
part of this,
yeah.
right? Somebody who's actually an expert at this, because my gosh, we are the hardest working bunch, all of us, of incredibly well-meaning, very well-educated volunteers. And we have, families and lives, and probably about 5 or 6 other committees on top of this. And I think that is one place that the outreach for the community went wrong, because we, I think, believed that our project manager was going to be taking on more of that. And in the end, it ended up being people like Tim and Anna May, and, who were also working real jobs and having real lives, and also working 30, 40 hours a week trying to communicate this. But there is a more efficient way to be able to do that. More time efficient, a more community friendly way to not only communicate information, but to also take in information.
So First, to be clear, I'm not against the survey. So maybe that's a point of agreement. If this survey is something to be done, the only point I would make about it is at the end, the public has to perceive that the conclusions of the survey
Right.
truly reflect. And some people will think it doesn't
And
by
perhaps
nature.
we're barking up the wrong tree by saying
But-
this needs to be a neutral party or whatever, but maybe that's the concept we're looking for. How do we get a community to accept?
But I don't think the survey is sufficient.
Oh, I don't think
Which
so
is
either.
why I pushed for the public hearing. I do think it makes a difference. The place that I learned this was the very first assignment I guess I had when I was first elected to the Board of Selectmen. It was the ALS Study Committee. And, it was $750,000 expenditure by the town. It was a expansion of the fire department staff. There were lots of reasons why people would be maybe skeptical. On the other hand, there were some pressing reasons why we needed to do it. And it worked out I was the chair of that committee. And what I learned, I didn't know it going into it, but people would come to the education meetings, and the way you figure out whether you've done what you need to do is, as long as people are still pushing back and asking questions and wanting to be heard, you got to figure out how to give them the time and the opportunity to push back and be heard. There were 6 whole months before that we had our town meeting with the ALS study, which is relative to a school is, I don't know, not even 10% of a school, where I was spending an incredible amount of times pushing back, replying to emails, replying to comments in Facebook and other various places, planning the education meetings. And the answer was, when is it enough? It's enough when the people who don't agree with you are satisfied they've been heard. Not necessarily that their view has been accepted, but they're
And I think that what we're
satisfied,
going
and
to-
that's what the problem was that we had with this project, is that there were too many people who weren't
Well, I also
satisfied.
think that there is a percentage of people who would never believe that being heard equated with and do what we want, right? That there was no shortage of comment, right? There was no shortage of public comment, trust me. I know, I have received the letters, I've seen the letters that you guys got. I saw everything the SBC. At some point, though, I don't think that many of the people who didn't vote for this didn't vote for it because of that, right? I think that they didn't vote for it. Our margins are always going to be very tiny, and if there is a percentage of people who don't feel as though they can compromise in any point.
Yeah, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, but Jess, I don't think that's right. I mean, of course, that's why I'm saying there is some number that's there, right? There's some number that's there, and that's why the target, you're never going to come up with something that 95% of people are going to support. So you can't set as your goal, here's something that 95% of people can support. But, and I will say, look, I was on the school building committee, and I went about it in good faith, and I spent a lot of time on it. But could we have done a better job? Yes. Could there have been more debate in that committee? Of course. Right? I mean, because there's one thing, and this is, I think some of this was a format. This is where the Zoom piece of it comes in. Now, I'm not blaming it on Zoom. Zoom is very good for, I ask a question, you answer a question. Right?
Right.
It's not great for the debate and the back and forth.
Right.
And what was, I think, and again, this is no criticism of me, of course not, but, or any criticism of my colleagues who have the good faith, there was not a sufficient debate on the committee such that people who were lobbying in these communications felt like we actually considered them. Right?
Because we couldn't meet face to face.
Well, and I just think the way, I mean, look, I think part of it, I think we don't have enough time to go through the whole list, and we've talked about this in the past, but I think part of it is that piece of it, that if you come to a meeting and the people who are making the decision, like we do, argue about it for an hour and a half, at least at the end of it, you come back thinking, okay, you know what? They considered it, they heard my point, they listened to it, they got what I was saying, and I didn't win, fine. And I think it's a fair criticism that if people watch the meetings, they did, and again, I will say, and again, and you don't have to believe me, I mean, I certainly agonized over a lot of this stuff, but if you're trying to show it and see it, you gotta see it.
Yeah.
You gotta see the fact, and that's what was missing, right? And I think that's where, and again, I don't think it's any criticism of the people on the committee, and I think there's a ton of unfair criticism, and I don't, I'm with you on plenty of stuff that you're saying, there's plenty of things that we say that were untrue, it doesn't make them true, but the true thing is that we can fix, is to fix that deliberative element of it. And that is, I think, the concern I have both with the survey becoming the the tablets from Mount Sinai, or some sort of prejudgment of what you call the strategic questions becoming that. Because then if people think, well, the real committee that matters is the school building committee, but they were already told what was to do 6 months ago, then you're going to have the same issue. Whereas I think you want to have that, the whole point of creating a school building committee that is more representative of the town is to facilitate that kind of debate on the committee, so that when people make substantive inputs, and it's not just to say, well, to think that people feel like they're being heard, but to take the points that are good and consider them and really evaluate it, right? And I think that's why I do think that you want to give that school building committee the longest leash possible, so that it can be the one to take those inputs. It can have that deliberation, right, back and forth, and come to a recommendation, as I said, that I think they can command 2/3 of the vote of a town meeting, a majority of the, and have the people who already know at least feel like they were heard. Right? Maybe, and as I said, some people are always going to vote no, so we should not say that we have to get to a 95% consensus, but we can get to a 60 or 65% consensus, and that's a fixable thing. That's a fixable thing that was in that we can correct the next time around. Like,
Yeah.
so I don't think it's all.
No, I think you're right. And
I don't think it's all
overall-
marketing. I don't think it's all this part of it. There's a substantive element to it, and you always have to be careful, right? And you always have to be careful that. People make, we all have become lawyers, and we've all become kind of mini political consultants.
Not me.
Not you, well, mini political consultants, right? And sometimes the arguments people make are the arguments they think are going to appeal to what they perceive to be the person they're trying to persuade to vote their way. And it's not always really what is motivating them. So, I don't think we need to go through every single argument that was made by everyone and think, well, that's why they did it. People have a fair number of reasons why they vote for things. They make a bunch of arguments. We don't need to rehash all the arguments.
Right.
But I do think in looking ahead to this next process, that is one lesson we ought to take from it, and that the new committee ought to take from it. And that's not something that is fixed by marketing. It's not something that's fixed by research. It's something that can be hopefully fixed by, a bigger committee, and that'll go about it differently, recognizing that you have to where we are, because we're not writing on a blank slate at this point. So I would caution you, and again, I'd say 3 weeks left, I'm hoping it's like 20 days if Marion can certify that election at like 9 o'clock on Monday night, on the 28th. Not to get bogged down in refighting the last war,
no.
Substantively, right?
But I think.
But also
the whole
expecting
thing
that it's gonna be the
is that
same-
We're looking to figure out how to
Right.
grease.
But also expecting that it's going to be the same issues that people are concerned about. Because, there's a lot going on when this process started. Obviously, went through the whole COVID period. We don't know how the introduction of whatever happens at the hospital, if anything happens at the hospital, will affect the way people think about this and all the rest of it. So, I would just caution everyone who will be involved in this not to be too bogged down in refighting the last debate. But I do think from a procedural standpoint and a process standpoint, that's where we could do better. Just from my own experience being on that committee and doing it in good faith, where we could have improved and kind of looking back over how it progressed.
If I could,
I don't think we
could I add
necessarily disagreed on that. There were prescriptive parts, and I wasn't on the SBC, so it's tough to kind of Monday morning quarterback, and I don't want to do that. I think that what we're all talking about here, and I think that this is the largest sense of, is what it goes back to in our first agreement, which is that we want a new educational facility for our kids that they can learn in, that does the town good over the long term. And perhaps we have gotten a little bit in the weeds around how we kind of grease the friction spots. But I think they're good suggestions.
Can I throw a comment, just to
Please.
append to Mike? Because I've been the one pushing for the public hearing. And for what it's worth, I've been hearing back from people who are saying, keep pushing for the public hearing. So it's not like just me. But the point, first off, something that I think at the tail end of your comment, this is a forward-looking conversation. This is not a backward-looking
No.
adjudication. It's what's the guidance, or what inputs should the building committee have, not just the building committee, school committee, board of selectmen, the town take forward into reconceiving a school project. What should they take into consideration that will basically set us up for a better chance of success than what happened the last time. That's the first point. The second point, the reason I've been pushing for one now in this interim period between the time we had failed votes and the time there's a building committee is it's sort of dead space time. And the purpose of the public hearing is to start to do something that brings the town as a whole back together into a shared conversation. We cannot do anything, and then when the building committee shows up, the building committee then has to deal with a fractured town that has all that division. So the method to the madness here, or the public hearing, is to do something that starts to close that gap again, so by the time the building committee does get here, you're talking to a relatively calm and once again friendly and collaborative group of residents that improve the chance. So that's what's behind what I'm pushing for here, is trying to get that gap closed at a time when we're not going to be working on the building itself. We're just trying to get back to where we can have the normal civil conversations that we usually, well, that we have most of the time in Medfield. You know, it's that.
So let's talk about timeline, since that's one of the things that we had talked about specifically. Let's really, I've heard lots of kind of dates thrown back and forth. What do we know right now? Right now we know that there's a school building committee bylaw group that has formed that is coming out with their recommendations to that. Thanks.
Hello, Anna Mae. Welcome.
O'Shea Brook has joined us. Come on in. So we know that, and we know we have ATM on May, what is it this year, 4th?
First Monday in May.
First Monday, yeah.
Okay. So, so at that point, we will vote or not vote in the school building bylaw, whatever that warrant article in the specific language ends up being. And so there's a lot of reflection that needs to happen back and forth as the committee is developing that. Then, talk to me about what happens after. You guys have all kind of put out dates and thoughts. Talk to me specifically about months right now. So it is the day after ATM. We have the school building bylaw. What happens? Does Scott or whoever is recommended by the bylaw then send out? If we were to say, yes, let's go. Let's make this happen.
Just a quick question on timelines. Do we start with the MSBA statement of interest in April?
I think that we pretty much agreed that we would do that. It's just we don't have to take it. Is that something that we agree on?
Well, I would like to know that we have some articulation of what the project is before we do it. Okay, there's some, so there's a...
So like, I would just say, can we table that right now?
Put it on the timeline.
We're saying it's
just
to initiate a process that we may or may not want to continue it, right? But it is a forcing function for us to also do some of the things that we...
I don't want to divert this conversation, but let me just quickly say why I'm bringing this up at all. Because if we're going down that path, we need to understand what that means. Because when I listen to...
All it means is that we put it in?
No. It means more. No, it means more than that. And what I'm getting at here is, if we're putting it in, when Dr. Marsden first suggested that at the school committee, I just happened to be listening to the school committee when that came up. His comment was, "Hey, put it in. If they don't accept it, then we haven't lost anything." Now, I don't know what he had in mind, but in the words he said, I was hearing him say, "Well, put it in this year and see if we get it." So that's kind of like, either we get it this year or we don't get it this year, and then we know where we're going. The fork in the road is right now.
I don't think that's what he said.
Well, he didn't say it. I was trying to understand what the implications.
I don't think we look at it that way either. So
okay. So my question then is, if we put that in, are we making a decision that we now are prepared to not take on a school project for 6 years or 5 years? What's the planning horizon for the school project?
Right. I think that's what we were trying to talk about, and like, I don't mean to interrupt on it, but I think Jess said that we're going to have a school building committee bylaw that would be formed. We're going to have an annual town meeting on May 4th. What would natural, I would say, is then there's going to be an appointment of the BSC.
But the decision on the SOI is in April. before.
So whether or not we put it in, so the school committee may want to use the SOI as a forcing function for us to help get the vision and the concept of what we would do, right? We're not saying anything, it's just, hey, that, you know.
Here's what
We gotta play.
So what I'm getting at, Tim, and this does tie into the town meeting. If what we're talking about is going in and going through, it's just the way you think. I'm not arguing for anything. I'm just trying to understand how we're thinking about it. If it's a straight up clean application to the MSBA, and we know from experience it's going to be probably 5 years before we get an answer, that has some significant implications for what we need to do with Dale. From a capital spending standpoint, we suddenly need, we can't do another 10 years of kind of the year-by-year waiting that we did that led to the neglect of Dale. So this is all practical stuff I'm talking about. I'm just trying to understand how to think about this. If we were, what I read, and maybe I just read it into how Jeff said that, I was kind of saying, he's thinking, you know, try to grab the brass ring when you go around on the merry-go-round. If you happen to grab it, then we got ourselves a project and we're ready to go. If we're not saying that, well, that's fine. I just need to understand how we're thinking about it because it has implications.
So, first of all, I think that the committee and Dr. Marston feel that, and I hope that as town officials, you feel that to simply say, we don't want to look for state funding, because we just don't know what that's going to look like, so we won't even apply for it, is fiscally irresponsible. We may, and I suspect that if we were to get into the MSBA, I don't know if we would or not. Really, you know, Millis just got put on the list for their feasibility study for their entire high school. So, you know, it ends up being a pot of money that the state has, and if there are a lot of high schools that year, then you get nothing. And it ends up being a priority around, you know, what buildings are in what shape and who's coming up, right? So
I understand all that, but how are we thinking about it?
Hold on. So if we don't apply, right, then we have no ability to work within the options of a new application to the MSBA that would be a project that so many of these things are closer to being done, that are not delayed. Many of these things were delayed during the pandemic because of the pandemic, because we went back. There's been about a year of delays. Honestly, do I think that we would be able to get a school done on our own before we had perhaps a smaller project or a different project with different population sizes? If we knew that the town was absolutely committed to this site or that site, or there was some sort of, it's a different animal this time, right? It's a different animal.
I'm not sure I followed what you said.
But I think, Gus, I think what you want to know is, is if we put in the application, does that mean we're just going to keep, not going to get a school until they say yes? In other words,
That's right.
He wants to know is,
That's not
we
what
put
we're
in an
saying,
application
no.
and they say no this year, then we're just going to say, all right, we'll apply again. That's what we know, right?
So what are you saying?
We are saying that it would
Just
be.
leaving the option open.
It's an
Leave
input.
the options
Yeah.
open. If we were to get in this year, and we are able to start talking to the MSBA, and then they are able to understand our issues, it is entirely possible that this could go faster.
What if it doesn't?
And if it doesn't, and we look at them and we have honest conversations with them, and our SBC is able to talk, and we have project managers and architects who do this work all the time, as Tim Bonfatti does, as Compass does. There's a whole process to this that you do not necessarily have to take as long as we did this time. We could have a faster timeline. If it's a renovation, it's possible to be a faster timeline. I don't know. But to simply close that option this year, and when there is no risk,
And there's a lot of flexibility, so it's,
I suppose, Gus, what I'd like to know is what is your hesitation? Because I suppose maybe we're just viewing this in different ways, because the way I understand it and what I believe Dr. Marsden was talking about that at that meeting you're referring to is why wouldn't we at least apply and see? I mean, because we would be remiss
Right.
to not at least try and see, what kind of funding we can get. Yet at the same time, do an analysis that if we, if we wanted to do it as a town to analyze, what are the, the cost benefits.
Again,
So
why
let
do we
me,
hamstring
I'm not looking for definitive answers anyway. What I'm trying to do though is I'm trying to get a picture of the planning context here.
Sure.
So I understand, first off, coming right into the April timeframe, we have a fork in the road. One fork would be, nope, forget it, the MSBA project didn't work. We are, in the interest of time, because I am sensitive to the arguments that were made about interest rates and about construction costs and all things like that.
Yeah.
We're at a fork in the road that either says, no, we're just going to take on a project on our own, or we're going to go down the MSBA route. So the suggestion was, well, you might as well put it in because you might get it. Now that tells me,
Gus, can I, like, for Anna, through your experience on the SBC and through the initial parts of the application, do you remember what the timeline is between the time that you submit your SOI and we were asked into the program where we had to make an official?
Isn't it December? You come back in
So
December?
So we've got.
Put it in April, they tell you in December.
Right.
Right.
I'm just trying to remember.
Yeah.
So there's actually, 7 months there. But if we were, that the SBC would be working, understanding what needs to happen, and if it looks as though, as a town, and the SBC decides that if we were accepted in, that it would be a good idea, then they have that option if we're accepted in. But if it looks as though there's a different direction they're going in, then we simply don't accept it.
so I'm not going to pin you down, I'm not intending to pin you down tonight with an answer here, but okay, the point I'm getting at is, okay, we put the SOI in, we form the building committee. The building committee does the preliminary work that it would do pending acceptance back into the MSBA program that we won't know whether we're in or not until December. My real question is, and if the answer in December is that we're not there, what's the plan? Is the plan...
That's the SBC's thing, isn't it? I mean, that's what the SBC needs to be working on at that time.
No.
Yeah, so the only reason
See what
I
I'm
was
saying,
trying to table the MSBA for a minute, because I agree with you, is, okay, so if we were to vote on the annual town meeting that we're going to form an SBC, can it be formed in June? And at what point might we have a concept design to bring forward to the town and say, hey, we need funding in order to go design? High level, I to say, is it January?
I think you should
Right,
be able
like-
to get to the basic concept of the big picture around that December timeframe, right? In the sense that if the concept, and then you can get advice from the professionals to say, does our concept work better under the MSBA strictures or not? Because there's some that might say, look, they're just never going to go for this, and so you're better off saying no. Or they may say, look, this fits what they're doing, and so it's going to be cheaper to take the money. And I think that's where you'd be making that judgment if you were in, and they make the decision for you and just not take it. And then you're still pressing ahead on our own with where we landed.
So I'm not intending to put words in your mouth, but let me make sure I understand what you just said, Mike. So basically, between the formation of the SBC, let's say in June and December, the SBC would be working on a concept for the school that would be prepared to be, assuming we got accepted into the MSBA program, we would be prepared to present, in fact, they'd be working the concept in conjunction with the MSBA, I guess, up to that point, to get to a concept that would be, so they're going to come up with, so my question is, are they working on the school that is the MSBA-supported school, or are they working on the school that is the town-funded school?
We need the town support first.
They're working on a school
We're working with the town
will
support. That's what we need
And then
first.
depending on the concept, it'll either be better or cheaper with the MSBA or not. I think that's the idea.
That's how I'm looking at it.
So we're gonna design-
You're not going to design the school. You're going to have
That's
preliminary
gonna take
feasibility
time.
portion of it. We're going to have some money available at town meeting this year to fund professional assistance for the SBC on that. And you're coming to those, you're not picking up plumbing, you're not looking at heat pumps, you're not doing all that stuff. You are coming up with a big picture standpoint, is it a renovation, is it a brand new school, is it an addition, whatever it is. From a high level, we think taking the input from the school committee on the educational goals, taking the public input we've gotten from the survey, from the meetings and everything else, saying, this is what we think is best, and this is what's best for the town. And then getting the advice, is this something that's workable within the strictures of the MSBA? How long do we think it would take, in the opinions of our professional assistants, all those kind of things? How does it interact with everything else? Because it may be, Gus, to your point, that part of what you give to the school building committees, we also want you to consider what you would do if you're going to reuse a Dale site. In other words, you can present that, and maybe the answer is, look, this is what we think is best, and it's just not going to work within the regulations, and so we're going to decline. Or if they say no, you're still prepared to go ahead, right? I mean, with
So this is where things start to connect in, because if we have a building committee that's putting together a concept, and what I just heard described, I think, is, no, we're going to develop the school that we think the town needs. And then we're going to, as we do that, we're going to look at what the MSBA requirements are, and if those MSBA requirements are compatible with what we think the school should be, then we're going to hope to get the MSBA reimbursement. We are not going to do any extra stuff that adds cost to comply with MSBA requirements and then get stuck holding the bag if the MSBA doesn't accept us.
Right.
Part of
MSBA
that,
could be a
part
pro
of
or a
that,
con.
conceivably, if in fact the school committee came up with this vision thing that I'm talking about for the elementary school grades, part of that process could say, no, in this big picture, the building we want to build, we want it to go, as part of our overall strategy, that overall vision, we want this next building to go at Wheelock, or we want this next building to go at Dale. And so the decision, when you're designing a building, you kind of have to figure out what the site is if you're going to design the building. I understand the MSBA process doesn't have you do that. That was part of what I think lit the fuse on this whole thing. But if we're going to design and determine the school we want and where we want that school and what do we want it to be, and then see if we can get into the MSBA program, that's the part that I had an impression that you didn't have that kind of flexibility. But maybe we do. Or maybe you can just kind of have the ultimatum, and if the MSBA says, hey, it just happened to be that you picked the right answers for the ones we like and we'll give you money for it, well, that's good. But you see what I'm trying to...
It's like their gates, I'm not the expert on it, I think, that's what,
Yeah, I
their
would
gates
think
every
it's
step of the way.
like-
You're eligible for X dollars of funding. That's a gate. Then, in order
Percentage.
to receive it, here's the process you need to follow.
Yeah, but the
Here's your
process, part
requirements.
of that process was, this neutral investigation into site. And so I'm
But I-
saying, if
but I
we
don't-
design what we want, we're going to design what we
But I
want, we're going
think
to say
that's
where we
going to
want
be
it.
the process coming forward,
That, like,
correct?
I don't think
It's-
you get away from process in
MSBA or
general,
not.
right? Like,
I mean,
that's
we-
part of the concept, is picking the basic thing.
We have to come
Addition,
together as a
that's the
town
big points.
collectively to go through those motions. We've learned a lot of lessons from the last time, and we really want a win this time. So I think moving forward, whichever group comes together, we'll
So
have those
Let me
conversations.
let me leave that right there. Let's assume that's all correct and you can do it that way. Here's my question. In December, if we don't get accepted into the MSBA, then what?
well, you have to tell me as steward of the town. No, obviously, we need to build a new school, right? So then we have to continue these conversations and make sure that we have a fully supported school building committee and that we are planning with them. We as a committee, you as the managers of the town, and that we are supporting them in the best way we can to make sure that this educational facility is supported by our entire town.
Yeah, and I would
We
assume
have
you'd
to
move,
be-
you'd move ahead with that concept just without the state funding. I mean,
Yeah, it's like, to me, it doesn't-
like you're gonna still go
It's-
ahead.
I don't-
at that point.
So
It's like
we
the
would,
goal is to get
Nobody's throwing the brakes
the
on this, Gus. I mean, truly, that's not, we aren't going to say, oh, well, yes, we should
I'm
say
not,
it.
yeah,
Yes, we
what
say
I'm
it.
just trying to do is get a picture in my head of whether this is, we're in it for 7 years if needs be, in which case there's implications for the Dale Street School maintenance.
Yeah.
Or whether we're saying, no, we're hoping in the first year we're going to come up with this school. If MSBA doesn't choose to admit us, we're just going to go and fund it ourselves. That, to me, would have implications for the building committee on what the school it designs is, because it has to be a school that we hope the state will subsidize, but if it doesn't, we know we can afford to build. That's going to have
Understood.
impact.
And
on
if the concept is broad enough at that point, you can squeeze it one way. Obviously, you have more flexibility without the MSBA and sort of saying, this is how we're going to,
But
this
you
is
have
how we're going
less
to do it.
flexibility because
You just have less
spend-
money. Right, right.
And we know we're going to have maintenance issues with Dale starting right away.
Well, what we're saying here is constrained, because one way or the other, with or without MSBA,
Yeah, we look at,
I think that that's the consensus.
won't hold you to it yet. Because frame, is it just this? You know,
right? Like, whether MSB or not, we have a concept plan, because the concept plan might not, there might be certain things in that that would prohibit us getting MSBA funding. So let's.
Yeah, well, that's,
so-
I agree with that, so I
Right.
agree, Tim.
So either way, you know, whatever the dollar figure is eventually, like, hey, I mean, MSBA gives us pros and cons, but I don't think it should be,
Door on that.
yeah, I'm not building like any kind of concepts that are like contingent on getting MSBA funding. That's what I'm saying.
Well,
Is it like,
there were a lot of MSBA standards that were identified as cost-adding components of the school, where if we're not going MSBA, we might choose not to do those in the interest of keeping it affordable.
And there are certain
correct, I agree with you.
standards that we need to
I agree with you. So-
do for footage and things, but,
but so, an example.
and I don't want to get
MS
too far into the weeds about worrying about those things. But
We only have 13 more minutes. Jeff.
Right, yeah, we're going to lose them, but MSBA will not fund anything
I don't
around a
have 13
public
more
rec
minutes.
building. We know
No,
that.
that's fine.
But could we use shared space and collaborate with that public rec building? We might be able to do that, and there's some dollars we've just saved that actually are probably comparable to MSBA. I'm wide open to that. That's where that's how I'm looking at it.
My only point was that as we move down in this direction, and if we are going down the MSBA route, there's clarity that we need about how much time we're willing to let that issue play out. If we want to let that issue play out for several years, I'm saying we have maintenance considerations for Dale.
I don't think
that we have to
anyone
take
said
into
that.
account.
I don't think
If we're not saying that, we're just saying this is a one-year.
That would be a good question to put on a survey.
No, like, well,
I'm not sure how, unless you can quantify the financial ramifications in that survey, I don't know how to do
I think that's what
that.
they're asking for. Like, what does it mean if we wait the X amount of years to get back in the MSBA for, in terms of
But you're,
the money we have to spend to prop up Dale before it crumbles to the ground? And inflation and, high interest rates, what's over under?
The war in Ukraine.
but one of our
And
priorities.
I don't want to we're all ignoring the obvious, that are we just throwing out this school that has already been planned and discussed? And you're making it sound like a new SBC is starting from like complete zero. And am I the only one that thinks that that's,
you've
Am I
heard
wrong?
from me, Megan. I don't think
It's
this
just
should
that
be, let's take a
school's
second
gone?
walk. This
That
cannot
you-
be, let's take a second whack at the same pinata.
that, well, as I said to you, there's still some that's in candy in that piñata, right? It doesn't just go away. Like, all of the educational input we heard from all of the teachers and all of the administration and from us,
Yeah.
it doesn't just go away.
But I think you have to
Can provide
prioritize
good-
that within there, what's going to be most important looking forward.
can be a
right?
really
If we're
good
not
way to
gonna-
Prioritize, yes, exactly,
So,
exactly.
Since we have 10 minutes
Is
left, I think, at least among this group, there's a consensus that we're not just going to wait until we get to the MSBA. There's not going to drift past January with nothing happening. So I think we can put that to bed as a concern. I think your question's been answered. Jess, are there other things you want to cover again in the next 10
No,
minutes?
I feel like we could do, if we want to do 10 minutes of opening it up to public comment, I'm
Yeah.
fine with that. I just want to make sure, as we leave here tonight, do we feel as though within a short period of time, by April, we could come to consensus on filing an SOI to the MSBA? That's what I leave
I think
this.
that's a good question. I think it's an
And I
important
think that
question.
it's one that we need to really pin down the fastest way possible. And obviously, the most important point is that, yes, we do need a school, and we need one sooner rather than later, and we need to make sure that that timeline is tight, but we also need to make sure that we're not just throwing money at the wall, that we're all being fiscal stewards of our town, and also educational stewards of our children. And that we all kind of acknowledge that everyone needs a chance to be able to say something. How that is collected, we don't know. I've heard bifurcated kinds of streams, right? Where we open to public hearings. I still don't quite know which body that would be. Is that the SBC? Is that...
Well, I pushed for us to have a public hearing this month, and one of the things we were going to do tonight was pick a date, at least that the Selectmen would sponsor a meeting. I think it would be better if it was a joint meeting. I think it's a low-pressure meeting in the sense that we're not trying to drive information out, we're just trying to get information in. And as I said, it's forward-looking inputs, and in my mind, as much as anything, it's a first step in trying to bring the town back together.
I honestly don't know what March looks like at this point for all of us, but we can certainly try to figure out. But there is also a second stream here, which is how we also get perspective on that hearing, right? How we get, not only do we have the public input at the microphone, but also what is this kind of neutral...
Make it a hybrid meeting. Let people come in on Zoom.
Oh, no, that's not what I'm talking about, sorry. Yes, absolutely. However people give us input, but there's also a survey and kind of independent data collection that we may need, so that there is a sense that that's something we also need to at least put within a group, either with us, within the town, of these two elected bodies, or gift to the SBC is something that would be a very good idea and something that they should strongly consider. I, again, understand your point about not wanting to tie their hands to a specific process, but we can agree on that. Okay, and we can also agree that by December, if we think about this, we are making a specific decision about how we proceed forward. Does that sound reasonable to everyone for leaving this meeting with this?
But by December, we're hoping to have an or special town meeting where we ask for funding to design something.
As long as it is not in a snowstorm on a football field, I'll take it.
Like, I mean, just to be a little more clear, I think that's what you were saying. I want to...
Well, I mean, it also depends on when the
It wouldn't be December, it'd be January.
It would be January. Also miserable on a football field.
Just on the public hearing point. So, I would suggest doing this after the election. When the actual people are going to do this. There are 3 days in March after the election. So, I don't know what you're thinking about.
I don't know. I mean, April is difficult for school populations in general. We have 2 weekends that are already ditched through school vacation week, and then there's an Easter vacation in there, or an Easter weekend that is also a little tough, but we can certainly take a look around at the...
We're talking about pushing it out to April.
Let's say sometime in the next 30 days, if we can.
But what about the 29th, 30th, or 31st of March?
You're just trying to get at it.
No, look,
I was thinking, what about the 15th or 22nd of March? Because those are Tuesdays, so those are our days.
But I mean, if we want to get input from the town on the 15th, it's like a week away. Like, let's make sure people can
We
attend.
have business
You're
to
absolutely
attend
right.
to, so we can't do those things.
So, to Tim's point,
No, I mean, it
if
doesn't
we're
have to
going
be
to try to
Tuesday
get
night either.
input from the town, we can't just say, next week, we'd like everybody to
Right,
come to my meeting.
right.
If this is indeed a public hearing, then it does also require posting and 2 weeks of posting, so that we really don't have, the 28th, realistically, we could hold one on April Fool's Day, but I don't think it goes well.
It's also a Friday.
Yeah.
Probably an opportunity.
It might actually...
You do it on Thursday.
I'm sorry, my calendar doesn't seem to have Easter on it, sorry. Anna, you know when Easter is, right?
April 17th.
April 17th, is it that late? Okay, yeah.
It's a Sunday this year.
Oh, okay, so that it's
Beginning of
actually,
break.
it's part of the break. So that actually relates...
It's the first half of April.
So the first half of April, yeah. We could probably make that work in one way or another, unless...
So we're going to
I
target
suppose
the first half of
timing
April.
is is important. However, I do think because Mr. Marcucci is not running again, he is a wealth of information, and I think your voice
Well, I
and
can
your
come and
input-
speak at MA, and I'll guarantee you I'll be there.
Are you as an invited guest?
Yeah.
It would be a shame to
Yeah.
lose that
Look,
bank
that's true.
of knowledge.
I think you ought to schedule it whenever you think you should schedule it. I think it should be when the people who are actually going to have responsibility for this are sitting here to do it. And that's been my view of it. But as I told you guys, I will schedule one if you want it.
Well, so two points here. First, Jess and Megan, I brought this point of a public hearing up to both of you. You're the only two members of the school committee I'm talking directly. In both cases, at least at the point that we talked, I didn't get a positive response. So my sense of urgency is that we've had votes that failed in November, and we've had virtual silence. And yes, December's holiday, January's COVID, February was still kind of bad, and now March is almost over. And then in April, we'll be closing in on the town meeting. So the sensitivity I have isn't so much about the particular date we do it on as a date. The sensitivity I have is that we've just taken 6 months and almost totally squandered it. And that's the piece that has been bugging me for months. That's fine. If
You might say we've taken 36 months and totally squandered it.
Yes, except this month we could have
So
done.
we could do it
Here's the
first
issue.
week.
All right, so first question, do we have a point of agreement? Do you want to join in? And you may need to, again, I won't pin you down tonight,
Yeah, we're
but
gonna
are you willing
discuss
to
this
join?
on our agenda on Thursday? So
Yeah.
I think we're willing to absolutely
Okay.
discuss it, and I've already
If-
planned that into the.
If you all are willing, I think the right way for us to do it is for the Board of Selectmen and the school committee to be doing this. It's not a high-pressure performance for either one of us. It's a listening thing. If you're willing to do that, I'm quite happy to not have it happen until April at a date that works for you. If you're not willing to do it, then I want to get this doggone thing done. So.
You've made that clear.
Yes, I know.
And we will,
So-
but
But regardless, Gus, you know, you do have that 2-week posting requirement, you have to get it into the papers, so essentially that brings us to the first week of April.
And I'm good with that.
So first week or second week of April, whether we decide to come with bells on, which I'm sure we will have a conversation about, and I will not forget the future, but I think we'll be there.
And the point is, it's forward-looking. This is asking for what we need to do going forward. This is not an adjudication or a who's fault. That's not the conversation.
Because your words, I thought, were perfect, and maybe I will repeat them. You said, what input should the school committee, SBC, and select board consider as they kick off the process? Like, I think that is a healthy and a great way to start and begin to gather consensus.
Simple agenda.
Or not get- I mean, gather.
It's a half-hour meeting. Nobody's got any
In
opinions.
the spirit of moving forward, you know, Mike mentioned some dates. I mean, should we at least put some dates out there so that on Thursday when we meet, we can have a date, we're moving forward, there's action being taken, and not, you know, let's check in.
Okay, so the school committee has a meeting on April 7th. I do not expect that to be a short meeting. Sorry, kids.
Did I hear 28th, 29th, 30th?
I think that's a little, it's a little fast for the people who will have just been elected.
They're
Yeah.
not elected, right? As of yet.
On the 28th.
on the 28th is the
Oh,
election.
28th,
Okay,
excuse
so-
me. Oh, sorry, okay.
I want to make sure that we're moving into that first week of August between the 4th and
Okay.
or the 11th to the, well, we won't do that Thursday, but the 11th to the 13th. Assuming we're planning on doing this in the
That's
evening, we're
fine.
planning on doing it on Zoom, and we'll take comment both from video as well as in person.
I'm going to suggest we do it as a hybrid, that we actually
Yeah.
do it in person, for the people who want to show up in person.
That's what I was saying,
Yeah,
we would do
okay.
both.
Okay, yeah,
And
yeah.
if it would be helpful, I'm sure that we can take a look at whether the high school auditorium is open at any point during that. I'm not sure, and I'm not going to promise anything, I just have to talk to.
You know, I'm going to suggest, it's fine if we know there's a whole lot of people going to show up, then I guess the auditorium makes sense. I'd actually suggest a public safety building.
Okay.
And the only reason is in an auditorium, it's a sort of linear,
Yeah.
dark place where a public safety
I always
building,
feel like I'm-
everybody's
yeah.
there.
Can the
I'm fine, and I
camera
think
be
that's,
at the public safety building?
Yes,
Because just the owl, it's just not coming
Yes,
through.
yes.
Well, okay, thank you.
There are real faults with the owl. So, sorry. He was useful at a certain point, It's tough.
So
Okay,
the-
so
so the
public
other-
safety, I think that's actually better.
The other positive thing that I would suggest that people consider is bringing in somebody like the Consensus Building Institute. They have a whole plan where they can try to help you through a contentious issue by
Great idea.
breaking off pieces of it, making decisions,
But
and then
that-
moving on to the next piece.
But that's after you get this input. This public hearing is not contentious issues, this is just inputs. If there's things that come
Absolutely,
out of
sure,
that,
that's fine.
then I think fine. Yeah.
But I
Pete and I
think,
talked about this, but throughout the processes, we're finding things that stick, that,
I mean, the only way that we have to get to a resolution is by having an election, a town meeting, and those are very difficult things to get
they're
to.
clunky
So that
mechanisms in this
if you,
way, yeah.
I mean, they just have a very much simpler system for getting town input and town voting, and if 65% of the people, 70% of the people vote this way, then hopefully the 30% or 35
That
would
might be a
accept it.
second or third step. I like that, yeah.
And you can then move on, so I mean, I think what we need is some sort of
Yeah.
decision-making process, finality, move on.
I think you're right. Okay?
Right. So I apologize, it's past 9, so we won't get to the public input of this, but we're going to have a hearing where people
Where
can
we're
come
going to
and
have a
give
hearing.
public input.
So
Yes.
we will have a hearing.
And so, anything
Do we want to
else?
look at a date right now, or do we want
Let's
to
look at a
discuss
date right
this?
now.
Maybe, well,
No.
actually, we need to make sure, is Christine around, just hovering?
She is.
She is around.
She can
She's
look
in
at
her
the
office, I
town
think.
calendar and, oh, she's like big sister, right there. I just wanted to see, you know, like, we need to have a main calendar. Go check this group. Hello, Christine, woman of the hour. Bring out your paper planner, and we are looking at anywhere between the 4th to the 8th, or the 11th to the, what, the latest would be the 13th, for a date for a hearing at the public safety. And I would obviously have to, we aren't going to decide anything, but let's pencil something in, or pencil a couple of possibilities in.
Couple of dates, yeah.
Give me a couple dates and I'll check. I don't keep the calendar for the public safety building, so I'll just check with them
Okay.
first thing tomorrow.
Okay, and I'll keep calendar with that, or I'll talk to Dr. Marshall and see what his calendar is as well. Or we could make this elected officials, much like this group now, if we chose to do that, and inviting guests, I mean, let's have a discussion about how we want that to be structured and what we think would be most useful. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Are we closing this?
Do you want to adjourn your meeting?
Do I hear a motion to adjourn the meeting, the joint meeting, the school committee? Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Anime moves. Megan, would you like to second?
Second.
Okay, and all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, our meeting is adjourned at
Thank you for coming.
9:04.
Yes.
Yes,
And our next meeting will be on Thursday, March 10th. at Medfield High School.
and I move that we adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
Any opposed? All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.